November 17, 1953, Arlington, Virginia. Karl Fenton stood at his bedroom window, watching autumn leaves skitter across the well-manicured lawn of his suburban home. The morning light cast long shadows as his neighbors emerged from their houses, briefcases in hand, heading to government jobs in nearby Washington. He checked his watch, 7:15 a.m. Time to join them. In the kitchen, Ruth prepared breakfast while their two children, Susan and Michael, bickered over who would get the last of the Cheerios. "Daddy, tell Susan it's my turn for the prize," 7-year-old Michael pleaded. Karl smiled, ruffling his son's hair. "Why don't you split it?" Ruth placed a cup of coffee before him. "You're late today. Big project." "Something like that," Karl replied, scanning the morning newspaper. The headlines blared about McCarthy's latest accusations of communist infiltration. He folded the paper and set it aside. "Will you be home for dinner?" Ruth asked, her voice casual but her eyes searching. "Should be, unless something comes up." He kissed her cheek, grabbed his briefcase, and headed for the door. "Don't wait up if I call to say I'm running late." Outside, Karl nodded to his neighbor, Frank Wilson, another government employee, as they both backed their Plymouths from their driveways. "Beautiful morning, isn't it, Karl?" Frank called. "Couldn't ask for better," Karl replied with a wave. As he drove toward Washington, Karl's mind shifted. The pleasant smile that had adorned his face at breakfast faded, replaced by concentration. He wasn't Karl Fenton driving to his mid-level position at the Department of Commerce. He was Kirill Fedorov, born in Leningrad, trained by the MGB, and planted in America 7 years ago as a sleeper agent, what his handlers called an illegal. His real mission had nothing to do with trade statistics. 3 miles from his office, Karl pulled into a small diner on Wisconsin Avenue. He ordered coffee and a donut, sitting at the counter with his newspaper open. At precisely 8:07, a man in a gray suit sat 2 stools away. "Nasty business in Korea," the man said casually. "Never seems to end," Karl replied, completing the recognition phrase. The man, Karl knew him only as Davis, was his cutout, the buffer between him and Moscow Center. They never acknowledged knowing each other beyond these brief, choreographed encounters. "My sister's hosting a gallery opening next Thursday," Davis said, stirring his coffee. "Small event, but interesting pieces." Karl understood the coded message. A package would be waiting at Dead Drop Site 7 next Thursday evening. Something important. "Sounds lovely," Karl replied. "Always appreciate good art." They finished their coffee in silence, Davis leaving first, Karl following 5 minutes later after confirming no surveillance. At the Department of Commerce, Karl was a model employee. Hired in 1946 with impeccable credentials, falsified records showing military service, education at the University of Michigan, and previous work at a shipping company in Chicago, he had risen to become an analyst in the Bureau of Foreign Commerce. His colleagues found him pleasant but unremarkable. He attended office parties, contributed to birthday collections, but remained somewhat reserved, attributed to his Midwestern sensibility. In reality, his position gave him access to classified information about American industrial capacity, technological developments, and export controls, all valuable intelligence for Moscow. That afternoon, as Karl reviewed trade statistics, his office mate, Robert Hillman, stopped by his desk. "Coming to the department mixer on Friday? I hear Reynolds from State will be there. Could be good for your career to meet him." Karl smiled. "I should be able to make it. Ruth doesn't mind these functions. Gives her a night off from cooking." "Smart man," Hillman laughed. "Say, what did you think about the materials allocation report?" "Henderson was asking about your analysis." "Just finishing it now," Karl replied, gesturing to the papers before him. "Nothing surprising. The aluminum numbers are consistent with projections. What he didn't mention was how those aluminum production figures, combined with other data he'd collected, helped Soviet intelligence assess American military aircraft production capacity. After Hillman left, Karl continued his work, mentally noting specific details worth reporting. His memory had been honed through rigorous training. He could recall numbers, names, and technical specifications with precision without writing anything down. That evening, Karl called Ruth to say he'd be working late. Instead, he drove to a park in Bethesda. He parked his car and walked casually along a wooded trail until he reached a particular oak tree with a distinctive split in the trunk. After ensuring no one was watching, he knelt to tie his shoelace, simultaneously slipping a folded document into a small crevice at the base of the tree. The dead drop completed, he continued his walk, circling back to his car. The message contained his analysis of the aluminum production figures, along with information about a new electronics manufacturing initiative he'd learned about through interdepartmental memos. Nothing individually classified as top secret, but the mosaic of information would be valuable to Moscow. As he drove home, Karl reflected on the duality of his existence. 7 years of living as Karl Fenton had created something unexpected, genuine attachment. He loved his children, who had been born in America and knew nothing of their father's true identity. His relationship with Ruth was more complicated. She was the daughter of a Minnesota banker, selected as an ideal spouse for his cover. Their marriage had been arranged by his handlers, though she had no idea. Ruth believed she had met a charming government employee at a Washington social function in 1946. Over time, something like real affection had developed between them. Sometimes, in quiet moments, Karl wondered what Ruth would think if she knew the truth, that their entire life together was built on deception. October 12, 1957, Washington, D.C. Karl sat with his family in their living room, watching President Eisenhower address the nation about Sputnik, the Soviet satellite now orbiting Earth. His children were transfixed by the gravity of the president's words, while Ruth looked concerned. "Do you think the Russians will attack us?" Michael, now 11, asked. "No, son," Karl replied, feeling the peculiar dissonance that had become familiar. "It's concerning, but not a cause for panic." After putting the children to bed, Ruth joined Karl on the sofa. "Everyone at the grocery store was talking about bomb shelters today. Eleanor Wilson says Frank is building one in their backyard." Karl took her hand. "That's an overreaction. This is about scientific achievement, not war. But you work for the government. Surely you must know more than you're telling me." He looked into her eyes, manufacturing the right mixture of reassurance and concern. "Trust me, if I thought we were in danger, we'd be taking precautions." The irony wasn't lost on him. He had known about the satellite launch plans months in advance, having passed information about American radar capabilities to Moscow through his handler. Now he was comforting his American wife about fears of the very country to which he had sworn allegiance. Later that night, as Ruth slept beside him, Karl stared at the ceiling, troubled by an unsettling realization. For the first time since his deployment, he had felt a flicker of pride at the Sputnik news, not as a Soviet agent, but as an American. The thought disturbed him deeply. June 3, 1960, FBI Headquarters, Washington, D.C. Special Agent Richard Walsh slapped a thin file onto the desk of his supervisor, Thomas Carrington. "I think we've got something," Walsh said, unable to contain his excitement. Carrington, a 20-year bureau veteran who'd cut his teeth during the war years, raised an eyebrow. "Another one of your hunches, Walsh?" "More than a hunch this time. Remember that surveillance operation on the Soviet Embassy cultural attaché? 2 months ago, we photographed him making a brush pass in Lafayette Park with this man." Walsh pointed to a grainy photograph. "We couldn't identify him initially, But last week one of our agents spotted him again, meeting with a known cutout at a diner on Wisconsin. Carrington studied the photo. And you've identified him? Karl Fenton, Department of Commerce, Bureau of Foreign Commerce. Been there since '46. Background. That's where it gets interesting. On paper, everything checks out. University of Michigan, Army service during the war, business experience in Chicago before coming to D.C. But when I started digging deeper, Walsh paused for effect. The Chicago company he supposedly worked for, their personnel records were destroyed in a fire in '47. Convenient. And his Army unit, I found 3 veterans from his company. None remembered a Karl Fenton. Carrington leaned forward. That's thin, Walsh. There's more. His Michigan credentials check out officially, but I called a professor who should have taught him. No recollection of Fenton. And here's the kicker, we have a photo of the Michigan graduating class of '41. No Karl Fenton. Carrington frowned. Could be an illegal. Deep cover. That's my thinking. Permission to place him under surveillance. Granted, but keep it tight. If he is what you think, he's been operating undetected for 14 years. He'll spot amateur hour surveillance in a heartbeat. Walsh nodded. I've selected our best men, and I want to run counterintelligence checks on everyone in his office, especially anyone with access to sensitive information. Do it, Carrington said. But remember, if he's an illegal, he has a handler, possibly a network. We don't just want him. We want everyone connected to him. July 17, 1960, Arlington, Virginia. Karl sensed something was wrong the moment he left for work. A blue Chevrolet parked 3 houses down had been there yesterday, and the day before. The driver, apparently reading a newspaper, was too still, too attentive. At the office, he noticed a new maintenance man working on the air conditioning duct in the hallway outside his department, the 3rd different maintenance worker he'd seen in 2 weeks. More troubling was the sudden interest from Henderson, the deputy director, in Karl's analysis of semiconductor exports, a request that came directly rather than through normal channels. By afternoon, Karl had cataloged 7 anomalies that, individually, could be dismissed, but collectively set off alarm bells. He was under surveillance. That evening, he followed his usual routine, driving home at his regular time, having dinner with his family, helping Susan with her algebra homework. But his mind was racing, evaluating options, considering tradecraft. After the children were in bed, he told Ruth he needed to run to the drugstore for antacids. You've been having stomach trouble a lot lately, she said, concern in her eyes. Maybe you should see Dr. Levinson. It's just work stress, he assured her. Budget season. At the drugstore, Karl bought the antacids, then made a call from the payphone in the back. He dialed a number he had memorized years ago but never used, the emergency contact protocol. When a man's voice answered, Karl said simply, "The weather in Chicago is unseasonably warm," then hung up. The warning was delivered. His handlers would know he suspected surveillance. 3 days passed with no contact. Karl maintained his routine precisely, looking for opportunities to determine the extent of the surveillance. He identified at least 4 different agents, 2 men in vehicles, one posing as a new neighbor walking a dog, and a woman who suddenly frequented Ruth's favorite grocery store. The morning of the 4th day, he found a classified ad in the Washington Post. Antique desk, colonial revival style, minor restoration needed. Available for viewing Tuesday only. The coded message was clear, extraction plan in place. Tuesday at the secondary emergency rendezvous point. Karl's stomach tightened. Extraction meant leaving everything behind. His home, his position, his identity as Karl Fenton. It meant abandoning Ruth and the children, disappearing without explanation. That evening, as he watched Michael pitching a baseball in the backyard, Karl made a decision that surprised even himself. July 26, 1960, Washington, D.C. Richard Walsh sat in an unmarked car across from the Department of Commerce, watching Karl Fenton enter the building. "Subject has entered the workplace," he reported into his radio. "All units maintain positions." The surveillance had been in place for 3 weeks. They had identified Karl's handler, a cultural attaché from the Soviet embassy, and documented what appeared to be a dead drop in Rock Creek Park. The evidence was mounting, but Carrington wanted more before making a move. "Sir," came a voice over the radio. "Subject's wife just received a phone call at the residence. She's packing a suitcase." Walsh frowned. "Stay on her." "What about the children?" "Still at summer activities. Due home at 3. Something was happening. Walsh's instincts told him their target was preparing to run. He made a quick decision. "All units, prepare to move on my command. We may need to take the subject into custody sooner than planned." Inside the Department of Commerce building, Karl sat at his desk, outwardly calm as he organized his papers. He had spent the morning copying select documents, nothing obviously classified, but containing information of value to his handlers. These he had concealed in a hollowed-out book in his briefcase. At 11:30, he told his secretary he wasn't feeling well and would be taking the rest of the day off. As he walked through the lobby, he noticed a man in a gray suit who had been reading the same newspaper for the past 3 days. FBI, almost certainly. Karl drove toward Arlington, but instead of going home, he parked at a shopping center and entered a department store. He moved through the men's section into housewares, then exited through a side door, leaving his briefcase behind a display of toasters. His contact would retrieve it within the hour. Outside, Karl hailed a taxi, instructing the driver to take him to Union Station. His mind was settled now. The plan was in motion. Union Station bustled with midday travelers. Karl purchased a ticket to New York, then made his way to the men's room. In a stall, he quickly changed his appearance, removing his glasses, attaching a false mustache, changing his tie, and putting on a hat. He emerged looking sufficiently different from the man who had entered. He then went to a bank of lockers, unlocked number 223 with a key he'd carried for years, and retrieved a package containing a Canadian passport in the name of Kenneth Ferguson, $5,000 in cash, and a train ticket to Montreal departing in 30 minutes. As he moved toward the platform for the Montreal train, Karl spotted 2 men in suits moving systematically through the station, showing a photograph to station personnel. The FBI had realized he'd fled. Karl quickened his pace, boarding the train just as the final call was announced. Finding his compartment, he closed the door and sat down, heart pounding. As the train began to move, he saw Walsh and another agent running alongside, too late to stop the departure. The plan had worked, but not the plan his handlers had arranged. Karl Fenton, or rather Kirill Fedorov, had made his own arrangements. The briefcase left at the department store contained genuine intelligence, his final delivery. But he wasn't heading to the extraction point his handlers had arranged, where he would have been taken back to Moscow. Instead, he was going to Canada, and from there would disappear using resources he had quietly accumulated over years, a contingency he had prepared without Moscow's knowledge. He had left Ruth a letter explaining that he had embezzled money from the government and had to flee, a fiction but better than the truth. He had also left instructions for an attorney to provide for his family financially through accounts established under another alias. As the train gathered speed, Karl reflected on the irony of his situation. He had betrayed his Soviet handlers just as he had betrayed America for years. He was now a man without a country, without an identity. Yet for the first time in many years, he felt a strange sense of freedom. September 3, 1971, Albuquerque, New Mexico. Kenneth Ryan, owner of Ryan's Books and Antiques, closed his shop for lunch and walked to the cafe across the street. The television behind the counter was broadcasting news about tensions between the US and USSR over Berlin. "Terrible business, isn't it?" said the waitress, nodding toward the screen. "It is indeed," Kenneth agreed in the slight Canadian accent he had cultivated over the years. After lunch, he returned to his shop, greeting Mrs. Sandoval, who was browsing the rare books section. "Found that first edition Hemingway you were asking about," he told her with a smile. His life as Kenneth Ryan was peaceful, anonymous. He had established himself in Albuquerque 5 years earlier, after several years moving between Canadian cities. His bookshop provided a modest income, supplemented by his savings. He lived alone in an apartment above the store, dated occasionally but never seriously, and had become a respected figure in the local business community. Sometimes he thought about Ruth and the children, now adults. He had maintained discreet surveillance through a private investigator in Washington. Ruth had remarried in 1965. Susan was in college at Berkeley, and Michael had joined the army. They had moved on, believing Karl Fenton had been a criminal who abandoned them. That afternoon, as Kenneth was cataloging a new collection of maps, the bell above the door jingled. He looked up to see a man in his 50s, wearing a well-cut suit despite the New Mexico heat. "Can I help you find something?" Kenneth asked. The man approached the counter. "I believe you can, Mr. Fenton. Or would you prefer Fedorov?" Kenneth's blood ran cold, but his face betrayed nothing. "I'm sorry, you must be confused. My name is Kenneth Ryan." The man smiled slightly. "My name is Richard Walsh. We've never met formally, but I spent quite some time looking for you about 11 years ago." Kenneth set down his pen. "I'm afraid I don't understand." Walsh placed a badge on the counter. "FBI. And yes, you do understand." They regarded each other in silence for a moment. "Are you here to arrest me?" Kenneth finally asked. "That depends on our conversation," Walsh replied. "May we speak somewhere private?" Kenneth locked the shop door and led Walsh to his office in the back. Once seated, Walsh explained, "We've known where you were for about 3 years. Facial recognition from a newspaper photograph of a local business association meeting. You've done well for yourself. If you've known for 3 years, why come now?" Walsh leaned back. "The landscape is changing. There's talk of détente. And frankly, the Bureau has bigger concerns than a retired spy who went rogue from both sides. What do you want?" "Information, in exchange for allowing you to continue your life here, undisturbed." Kenneth considered this. "What kind of information?" "Names, methods, communication protocols, your training. We want to understand how the illegals program works. Not for prosecution. Most of your contacts are long gone or back in Moscow, but to improve our counterintelligence." "And if I refuse?" Walsh shrugged. "Then tomorrow Kenneth Ryan ceases to exist. Your assets are seized, and you face espionage charges." Kenneth was silent for a long moment. "I need assurance that this stays between us. No publicity, no trials, no exposure." "You have my word," Walsh said. "The Cold War is fought in shadows. We prefer to keep it that way." April 12, 1987, Albuquerque, New Mexico. Kenneth Ryan sat on his balcony, reading about Gorbachev's reforms in the newspaper. At 72, his hair was white, his face lined, but his mind remained sharp. His bookstore, now managed by a younger partner, continued to thrive, though Kenneth worked only part-time. The telephone rang inside. He rose stiffly to answer it. "Mr. Ryan? This is Rebecca Daniels. I'm a journalist with the Washington Post." Kenneth's grip tightened on the receiver. "How can I help you, Ms. Daniels?" "I'm researching a story about Soviet intelligence operations during the Cold War, specifically illegals placed in the U.S. during the 1940s and 50s. I've come across some information suggesting that a Commerce Department analyst named Karl Fenton, who disappeared in 1960, may have been such an agent. Kenneth's heart raced, but his voice remained steady. I'm afraid I don't see how I can assist with your research. Mr. Ryan, I have reason to believe that you and Karl Fenton are the same person. A long silence followed. Kenneth had prepared for this possibility for decades, yet now that it had arrived, he felt oddly calm. Ms. Daniels, that's quite an accusation. May I ask what evidence leads you to this conclusion? Declassified FBI files, facial comparison analysis, and an interview with former Special Agent Richard Walsh. Walsh, the man had promised discretion, maintained it for 16 years, but something had changed. I see, Kenneth said. And what is it you want from me? Your story, Mr. Ryan. In your own words, the human side of Cold War espionage. Kenneth thought about Ruth, who had passed away in 1982, about his children, who had lives of their own, still believing their father was a criminal, about the decades he'd spent in the shadows, a man without a country. Ms. Daniels, I'm an old bookseller in New Mexico. Nothing more. But let me suggest something. The real stories of the Cold War aren't about heroes and villains. They're about people caught between ideologies, making impossible choices. If you're writing about such things, remember that. Is that a denial, Mr. Ryan? It's all I have to say on the matter. Goodbye, Ms. Daniels. Kenneth hung up and returned to his balcony. The call would have consequences, he knew. His carefully constructed life might soon unravel. Yet strangely, he felt a sense of relief. The Cold War was ending. Perhaps it was time for the truth to emerge from the shadows. 3 days later, he received a letter postmarked from Virginia. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a short message. Dad, I've always known something wasn't right with the story we were told. If you're reading this, I want you to know I understand choices made in difficult times. Whatever the truth is, I'm ready to hear it. Michael. Kenneth held the letter in trembling hands, tears blurring his vision. After all these years of hiding in plain sight, perhaps it was time to step into the light.